Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Okay. All right. So I'll be talking about ellipses today, and I want to start by briefly introducing what I mean by ellipses. So in particular, we'll be talking about two types of ellipses, VP ellipsis and sluicing. And so we're going to be looking at English today, and VP ellipsis, in fact, is mostly studied in English, even though similar constructions will exist in other languages. And sluicing is an extremely cross-linguistically prevalent type of ellipsis. Suppose you want to say, I don't want to go to the store to get milk, but I might have to go to the store to get milk. Now that's a pretty redundant way of saying this, and it doesn't sound very natural. But by ellipsis, we can actually drop the entire second occurrence of this verb phrase. Sluicing is similar, except it allows you to omit entire clauses. So you can say things like, I hope that I can travel to Africa one day, but I don't know when. All right, now, in terms of theories of ellipses, I think they can be productively analyzed as falling into two camps: identity theories on one hand and referential theories on the other. According to identity theories, ellipsis is grammatical only if the elided material is identical to its linguistic antecedent in some way. And so going back to the previous example, I don't want to go to the store to get milk. This is the antecedent verb phrase. And then the ellipsis side here, as you can see, is in fact identical to the antecedent. And as many of you will know, ellipsis theories, or identity theories, I should say, come in various flavors. So there are syntactic identity theories, semantic identity theories, and hybrid identity theories. And and one thing they all have in common, and what's important for this talk, is that they all claim that there is some representation at the ellipsis site, at some level of representation, okay? And that representation is identical to some linguistic structure in the context. That's sort of the core claim that's important for this talk, for my purpose. And I'm contrasting this with a class of theories that, referential theories that claim that ellipsis is a form of discourse reference, not unlike pronouns, where the idea is that the ellipsis side just contains a silent proform, and that proform recovers the meaning of the ellipsis clause referentially the same way that a pronoun would, okay? And support for referential theories comes from the fact that ellipsis patterns similar as other referential devices in that it exhibits certain diagnostic properties. So for example, ellipsis can be used exophorically, can be used cataphorically, can have split antecedents, multiple antecedents, non-local antecedents that go several sentences back in some cases. It can yield floppy interpretations, and it can point to inferred reference. And so if some of those terms don't mean anything to you, that's okay. For today's purposes, we're just going to be focusing on this last part, the inferred reference part, right? And so while we keep this in mind, I would also quickly like to introduce that there are two core research questions, I think, for these types of theories. For identity theories, they're in the business of identifying the correct notion of identity by refining their definition in order to capture the distribution of ellipses. And by distribution of ellipses, I just mean basically classifying sentences that involve ellipses as acceptable or unacceptable, okay? And on the referential side, I would like to suggest that the core question is, what determines whether an inferred referent is available for ellipsis in a given context? And you'll see that the research that we've been doing in this area, and some of which I will be talking about today, is trying to sort of chase down this question. It's a rather big and complicated question. Okay, so today I'm just going to talk about two short case studies. It's a very brief excerpt from our work. And the first one will focus on VP ellipsis, and the second one will focus on sluicing. All right, VP ellipsis first. Suppose you overhear a conversation between a spectator and a magician, stage magician, and the spectator says, "Can I please see that card trick one more time?" And the magician says, "I'm sorry, I can't." Okay. Now you think to yourself, what does that mean? And you probably come up with something like this, right? "I'm sorry, I can't show it to you one more time." And that's interesting because if you pay attention exactly to what the context provides you, there's actually a certain inference you need to perform to go from see the cardboard one more time to show the cardboard one more time, right? You recognize this as a request, and you are denying the request. And in order to do so, you need to recover this inferred meaning. And in the experiment I'm about to describe, we compare those types of dialogues with a variant where there's actually no change in verb. Okay, we call this the no change item and the change item. So that would be, I'm sorry, you can't see it one more time, where this, of course, is pretty much the same as that you have up here. So in terms of the theories of ellipsis, you can think about this as this is the one that preserves identity, and this is the one that requires an inference. Okay. All right. So what do we do with these items? So we wrote a bunch of them, and then we present them to native speakers of English in a standard acceptability judgment task. So they read a dialogue. We ask them to focus on the second utterance, the one with the ellipsis site, and then they judge them in terms of their acceptability from 1 to 5. In the second part of the experiment, we show them a different task where, again, they read the same dialogue. Yeah, again, they focus on the second utterance, but this time they don't judge it in acceptability, but they paraphrase it. And we do this by actually inserting a text box where otherwise the ellipsis site would have been. Okay, and we ask them, what exactly does the second speaker mean? They use their own words and they just paraphrase it freely. And what we do with those paraphrases is we basically look at the verb only for the purpose of this experiment and compare it to the verb in the antecedent. And I'll show you what that means. The results are twofold. On the left-hand side, I'll talk first about acceptability, which is here plotted on the y-axis. Yeah? And on the x-axis, we have the two types of items that I described earlier, change items and the no change items. The no change items are completely at ceiling. The dashed line indicates the fillers, the acceptable fillers. So these are perfectly normal sentences on anyone's theory, and you can see the no change items pattern exactly with it. There is no significant difference here. The change items were significantly degraded, but only to a very small amount. And you can see, and these are the ones that involve some inference, right, with a different verb. And you can see that they're still a lot more acceptable than what would be unambiguously ungrammatical items. This is the dashed line down here. Okay, so there is a degradation that's happening with these items. However, it is actually relatively small, and there's still a pattern up here. There's still pretty good sentences according to people's judgments. Now, on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the results from the second task where people paraphrase the ellipsis site. And I'm plotting on the y-axis the percentage of the antecedent verb being used in those paraphrases, as opposed to some other verb. Okay, and you can see that the no change items once again pattern with the fillers. So think of this as the baseline, and people basically say, yep, we need the antecedent verb here in order to paraphrase this ellipsis site. However, the change items, very rarely do people plug in the antecedent verb, okay? And so that just verifies that in fact an inference is taking place. People do infer meanings as per their paraphrases that have to be inferred from the context. And this paired with this suggests that doing so doesn't substantially degrade the use of ellipsis. There is a little dip, and it's very interesting, and I think we can talk about that and design follow-up studies to understand this exactly. However, it by no means does it render the use of ellipsis ungrammatical. At least that's not what the data suggest here. Okay, so that's the first experiment, and this is about VP ellipsis. This is just a brief reminder here what type of items we're talking about. Okay, now onto the second part, where I'm going to talk about sluicing. And in particular, the types of sentences I'll be talking about in this part are like this. Jackson is jealous, but no one knows who. Now that should strike you as a horrible sentence of English. And the second one should be a lot better. Jackson is jealous, but no one knows of who. Okay, these are famous minimal pairs. They've been in the literature for a long time. They've been cited in support of identity theories for decades, and they have in particular motivated a particular theorem derived from identity theories. You can derive them from various flavors of identity theories, and here's the theorem: no new words constrained. Okay, the elided material must not contain any words that are not provided by the antecedent. And you can see just by the wording of the constraint that basically follows from the identity claim, right? Now, this captures exactly why this one is bad and this one is good, right? Because there is a preposition here that's been stranded into the ellipsis site, which then has been elided. And that preposition is actually not found in the antecedent, right? Because this is a verb, this is an adjective that doesn't have to have the prepositional part expressed explicitly. And so in this example, on the other hand, it has been piped out of the ellipsis site. And so now it's actually explicit and it hasn't been elided. And everything that's been elided is in fact analogous to something in the antecedent. Okay, so the idea behind the no new words constraint, motivated specifically to capture these type of minimal pairs, is that by just making identity claim a little bit more specific about the specific words at the ellipsis site, we can capture this difference. Okay, so in the experiment I'm about to show you, I verify these claims about the existing items, and I also compare them to new types of items. Again, we're going to be looking at dialogues as we did in the first experiment. So for example, imagine somebody says, "Can I borrow your textbook?" And you say, "Which one?" Now that intuitively strikes me as a relatively acceptable question to ask, and I'll show you the data shortly. However, if you think about what that means, you probably come up with something like, which one do you want? Which one do you need? Which one are you asking about? All of which will, if you paraphrase them, require lots of words to be introduced into the ellipsis site that are not actually provided by the antecedent. So by virtue of this dialogue dynamic here with a request and a clarification question, it seems like there is an inference that's taking place that would intuitively run counter to the no new words constraint. Okay, and the experiment was designed to just explore this quantitatively, these intuitions. Okay, going forward, I will be calling these the classic bad items and the classic good items. So this is the classic minimal pair, right? And then these we'll just call the inference items because intuitively that's what's going on here. All right, so as before, we provide people with two tasks. The first one is a standard acceptability judgment task, again, highlighting the elliptical utterance in this dialogue. And the second one is, again, a paraphrase task. However, this time, we don't look at the identity of the words so much as the number of new words that people use in these paraphrases relative to the entire linguistic context. Okay, so I literally will go ahead and like take everybody's words in their paraphrases and just count the ones that don't occur anywhere in the antecedent. Okay, and I'll show you first the results of the paraphrase task this time. So the mean number of new words is down here. You can see it ranges from 0 to 4. And I'll show you averages for items split out by different item types. So the bad variants of the minimal pair here, the good ones here, and the inference items here. So classic items look like this. Now this is basically a bimodal distribution ish. It's sort of bimodal-ish, but there's a significant difference here. I think the effect size is about 1. So there's about 1 more word in these items, in the paraphrases for these items than these, which makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because those are the ones where there's been a preposition stranded into the ellipsis site. So as you paraphrase it, you may want to mention that preposition, which you don't do here because it's been piped out of the ellipsis site. So think of this as a verification of this, this experimental paradigm. It captures the difference these minimal pairs are designed to highlight. Okay. Now, what about the inference items? Well, the inference items actually involve way more new words in this paraphrase task than either one of these two. Okay, so there's a significant difference between the bad ones and the inference items. But that's only half the story, right? This is only laying the groundwork. The real big question now is acceptability. And so once again, I'll show you first a minimal pair from the literature. Looks like this. A beautiful bimodal distribution. This time it's actually a bimodal distribution. There's some items, and I should also say that these have never been tested experimentally before, because the literature where they were cited is not the kind of literature that would have lots of experiments in the past. So this is sort of novel, but it's just to verify, you know, there's actually this minimal pair actually works the way it was supposed to, except for maybe some individual exceptions here.
You have 2 minutes.
However, the big, sure,
2 minutes.
Thank you. Yes, the big question is, how do the inference items pattern with this, right? So at this point, we can already say that no new words constraint does a great job. It identified the difference in new words at the ellipsis site as causally related to the acceptability, and it produces this huge effect in acceptability, okay, in terms of the classic items. Now with the inference items, things don't look so good anymore, right? Because they pattern with the good cases You know, I think there is a significant difference here, as in they're a little bit worse than the good ones overall, but you can see the distribution very much patterns in the same way as this one. However, we saw previously that they actually involve even more new words. So it looks like, you know, if we sort of extend the set of items we apply this constraint to, it seems like it doesn't do such a good job anymore. And I'll leave you with this final representation of the results here, where I have the mean number of words on the x-axis, and I'm plotting it against the acceptability in a single plot. So that's basically combining the last two plots. And the symbols are the same thing. So look for these two to see the classic items, and for this one to see the inference items. And by the no new words constraint, or by extension, an identity theory of ellipsis, we should see an overall inverse relationship. As the number of new words increases, acceptability should go down, right? And you can see that that's exactly what we find with respect to the classic items, right? The minimal pairs are connected by lines here, okay? And you can see that all the lines are aggressively downward sloping. So you lose a lot of acceptability as you increase the number of new words in the paraphrases, even by just a little bit. In other words, the no new words constraint applied to the classic items did exactly what it was meant to do. It explains exactly this difference on an item by item basis. The inference items, on the other hand, actually live in a very different part of this plot, right? So they have way more new words in the paraphrases, but they're also reasonably acceptable. And within this class, if anything, you'll see a positive trend, not a negative trend, which I wouldn't put, you know, I wouldn't overinterpret this, but it's certainly not what you'd expect from the no new word constraint. All right, so then just in conclusion, I showed you two case studies, experimental studies of ellipsis, one on VP ellipsis and one on sluicing. And I would suggest that taken together, they show the possibility of inferential ellipsis resolution, even when those inferences go above and beyond identity with the linguistic material provided in the context, okay? And zooming back out to the big picture about theories of ellipsis, I believe that those results, among others, favor the referential theories, because on the referential theories, inference is actually expected. Why is it expected? Well, because all other referential devices allow for some sort of inferencing. They're not all tied to the exact linguistic antecedent in the context. They all allow for some degree of inferences. On the identity theories, on the other hand, those don't follow naturally, and they would have to refine their definition of identity to accommodate these findings. And with that, thank you for your attention.